Hello, and welcome to the La Jolla Presbyterian Church Women's Bible Study for Wednesday, January 31st, 2018. Our teacher is Cynthia Blaze, our Director of Women's Ministries, and we're going through the story, a 31-week journey through the entire Bible. This week is week 18, the story of Daniel. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.
Thank you, ladies, for being here this morning. Let's start by opening in prayer. Father, thank you so much for this morning, this time we have together, these women that are here. I pray that you will help me to be able to speak your word and your truth clearly. I pray that you will help the ladies that are here and those that are listening to be able to understand. And I pray that through this, you will draw us into a deeper connection with yourself, that we may know you and love you and walk in your ways in all that we do. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. So thank you for being here. I'm excited to do Daniel today because Daniel has such great stories and it's so fun. And it's one of those, we've been through a lot of books and a lot of moments that are like just sad, and it's like, oh, they failed again. Oh, they just failed again. And even though Daniel occurs during this period of kind of sadness or darkness during the exile, there's such hope and encouragement in the faithfulness that we see in these people and these men that it feels very very encouraging. It's fun. So just to sort of review before we get up to Daniel, last week I talked about that I feel like for me, it's been helpful to begin to think about the Old Testament in sort of periods and time periods, and then to begin to think how the books of the Bible fit into those different time periods. And for the scripture timeline I did, that's how I did it because I wanted people to be able to see how how those periods progress from one to the other. And for at least for me, that helps me to be able to begin to put everything in context. And so, we start with creation. And in creation, we learn that we have this triune God who is good, who loves us, and has created us for what purpose? What's the purpose of God created us for? Relationship, exactly. And then we learned that there's sin and the fall, and it mars this perfect relationship. But that God has this rescue plan in mind, and that somehow this offspring of Eve is going to crush the head of the serpent, of Satan. And then we move into the patriarchs, this time period where God reaches out and establishes a covenant with a certain person. This thing can be passed through his generations. And we've talked so much about the 3 Ps of that covenant of progeny, right? That he'll have as many descendants as the stars in the sky, the sand on the shore. And then what's the next one? Place, that there's a certain place that's given to Abraham and his descendants. And then the 3rd P is promise, this ultimate promise that all the nations of the world will somehow be blessed through this progeny of Abraham. And then we walk through this blessing that then gets handed down to his other sons, to Jacob, to Isaac, to the 4th son, Judah. And through that, we begin to get this sense that not only is there this great blessing, but that there's a person that's going to come. This person from the line of Judah is going to be a king. And it's through him that all the nations in the world are going to be blessed. And we move in, and through that time period, because of famine, all of the Israelites end up in Egypt, and we get the great stories of Joseph, and then enter Moses. And now we get our period of the Exodus, of desert wandering, where God continues to reveal himself, and now to the whole people group. And at this point, they are pretty numerous. It's thought that there may have been up to 2 million people that left Egypt, which is incredible to me. And God leads them in a way to continue to create relationship. We all remember, led by cloud by day and fire by night, and he provides food for them, the manna and the quail, and that they could only collect enough for how much? One day, right? And that then if they collected for more than a day, then what would happen to it? It would rot. And so this sense that God wants a relationship, an intimate relationship, a daily relationship, we see that. And through this time period, we also see the law established, that the law is good. And we also see that the tabernacle is created and the sense that God wants to dwell in the very, very midst of his people, but he's so holy that people actually can't be physically around him. And so that's the most holy of holies. The center of this tabernacle is where he dwells. And only the high priest, right, once a year after offering atonement can go into that holy of holies. And if he hasn't offered enough atonement for his own sin, then what happens? Just dies on the spot. And I told you about how they would attach a rope with a bell to his leg so if he fell, they would know and pull him out. And then we get to this point of entering into Canaan, and Moses dies and Joshua is in command, and they conquer most of Canaan, but not all of Canaan. And the problem is God has said, to purge the land of Canaan for their own protection, because the sin, the idolatry of those who live in Canaan is so great. And, those are hard. That was a hard week. We don't like to hear about that, but we understand the purpose and the point behind that was to create this safe place for the Israelites to dwell. And because they don't fulfill that, they're going to constantly struggle with idolatry, because they do end up allowing many of the people to stay. And we get those great stories of Jericho and Rahab during that time period. And then Joshua dies. And there's no central leader. There's no central person in command. And we get now our time period of the judges, where these people are raised up to lead and to judge the people of Israel. But it's a time where they continue to struggle with their own sin, right? And we have these great moments where God raises up a judge, and during that, and they're able to defeat sort of their enemies. But then at that point, after that judge dies, they go back into worshiping into idolatry. And then God will allow another nation, often the Philistines, to attack them, so that they will then cry out to God, and God will then raise up another judge. And so we get this sort of cycle of judges that we kind of go through that period. And because of that, and so after the time of because the time of the judges is so chaotic, that people crave order. And so they ask for a king. And now we get into our period of the monarchy. And first, who's our first king? Saul. Exactly. After Saul, it goes to David. And David is not his offspring. Saul has some moments of great in unfaithfulness to God, and God removes that mantle of authority from him, and it's passed to David. Now, after David, it is passed to his son, Solomon, and after Solomon, it's passed to his son, Rehoboam. Now, this is our period of our united monarchy, and it's 80 years. We have a centralized government. We have a strong leadership. They're able to really become their own autonomous nation during this time period, which is really interesting. But then with Rehoboam, it's just like, we're like, come on, Rehoboam. Where, remember, the people of Israel come and they say, your father laid a heavy load on us. Because at this point, we've had this huge building campaign, and we've had the temple finished, and the walls of Jerusalem finished, and the palace finished. And there's been a lot of unscripted labor during this time period. And they don't want that much labor anymore. And so they ask Rehoboam, are you going to lighten our load, or are you going to be heavy? And he comes back, heavy. And at that point, the 10 northern tribes split. And they leave, and they elect a military leader, Jeroboam, to be their leader. And then at this point, we followed for the last couple of weeks this divided monarchy. Now we've had one line of Judah, one line of Israel. And we've gone through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, parts of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and their narratives, they're considered to be understood as truth, as taken literally, but they still have this, what we call a theological lens, where they're viewing all of these kings by whether they were faithful or not faithful. And on the line of Israel, I said there's only one faithful king. Do you remember his name, anyone? Jehu, the only faithful king from the line of Israel. And in Judah, we do have some bright spots of very faithful kings. We've got Asa, Hezekiah, Josiah. There's some great moments of great kings. But still, the idolatry of Judah is so great that God says that he is going to send them into exile. And because it goes all the way back to our covenant, right? That there is this promise that this place is yours. This land of Canaan is yours, but you have to be faithful to me, is what God was saying. That they had to uphold their end of the covenant to live in that land. And so because they haven't upheld their end of the covenant, God is going to send them in to exile. And last week we talked about Judah and going into exile. And we talked about how, just for a little bit of a review, so Nebuchadnezzar is on his invading march. He is taking over pretty much all of the ancient Near East at this point. And just looking at it historically, he starts his taking over march as soon as he actually comes into kingship, which is amazing to me. Like, in a matter of years, he has taken over the ancient Near East, which is incredible. So he has his invading march, and for the first time, he comes through Judah, and Jehoiakim is king at this point. And he just makes Jehoiakim his vassal. He doesn't destroy him. And it says he takes some of the articles of the temple, and we find out he will take some of the elite of the nation with him. And this is when Daniel is going to go into exile with him. And that's where we're going to pick up today, which is fun. But, and at this point, is Judah destroyed on this first march? No. Judah is still its own nation. They're under the authority of Babylon, essentially. So, but around 598, Jehoiakim rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm going to call him Nebi because his name is too long. So Nebi starts his next march on Jerusalem, and in this process, as he's marching, Jehoiakim dies and leaves it to his son, Jehoiakim, to face Nebi. So now Jehoiakim is king. He's only king for 3 months when Nebuchadnezzar arrives. And it's like, thanks, Dad, for rebelling. There's an army at my door. And he just surrenders. He's like, I'm not dealing with you. So he surrenders. And at this point, he is taken into exile. And the big wave of all of the elite are brought into exile with him. But Nebuchadnezzar leaves a king, puts his uncle on the throne. So we still have a king from the line of Judah, and that's Zedekiah. So Zedekiah is now in charge, and for 9 years, Zedekiah is going to reign. But he's going to rebel. He's going to decide he does not want to be under the authority of Nebuchadnezzar, and now Nebuchadnezzar has his final march towards Jerusalem, and at this point, he is done with rebellion, and he is just going to sack Jerusalem. So he destroys the temple, he destroys the palace, he destroys the walls. And at this point, Judah is no longer. And so there is no king. He leaves one of his own governors in charge, and he transports the majority of the people left into exile. But what's interesting that I love is that, so Jehoiakim is the one taken into exile, the king from the line of Judah. Now, after 37 years, he's going to be released from prison. He's going to be treated well. He's going to dine at Nebuchadnezzar's table. And we get this really neat sense of hope that we're not done with the line of Judah, right? That there's still, the kingly line still exists. We still have this person sort of that we're able to then trace the lineage of Jesus too. And so when the gospel writers trace the ancestors of Jesus, you'll see that they go through Jehoiakim because he was the one that was left alive. Yes. I know. So it's Jehoiakim, and then Jehoiakim was his son. So Jehoiakim is the one that is left alive when his dad dies, and Nebuchadnezzar arrives, and he just surrenders. Yeah, he's like, I'm not. Exactly. So Jehoiakim, yes, I know the Kims and the Kinsey. I'm going to mess it up right now. So Jehoiakim is the one who is originally made a vassal but rebels, and then his son Jehoiakim is the one who surrenders and is taken into exile. I know. I have to look at my own notes to get that straight. And then last week we talked about, even though we end in exile, that there's still this hope that's offered through the words of Jeremiah, which I love. And Jeremiah talks about that this exile is only going to be for 70 years. And that also this future greater king is still coming. and that a new covenant is going to be formed that's going to be involving changed hearts, which is so much fun to read about. And so from the line of Judah, it says that there will come a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely. In this new covenant, God will write his law on our hearts and minds, that no longer will the law be written on the doorpost, and stuck, there, which was a great, it was a great remembrance, for the Jewish people to write the law on the doorpost. But just to think that now the law is written on their hearts and their minds is amazing to me. And that God's relationship will no longer be mediated by a high priest in this coming covenant, that everyone will know God, from the least to the greatest. And so those verses in Jeremiah talking about this new covenant that's coming, I feel like we get that because we live in the time of the new covenant. We live after Jesus has come, and we get that. I think sometimes it's hard for us to think before the new covenant, what must that have been like to not have the Holy Spirit living in our hearts? What was that like to not really be able to have a changed heart and a changed mind like we do? And then the best part of this new covenant is God says he will remember the sins no more of his people who love him and follow him. So, all right, so this week we get to look at the book of Daniel. So Daniel is considered a prophet. He's in the prophetic section of the Bible. And I talked about in the last 2 weeks, I've mentioned just these prophets, that the prophets are classified into 3 categories. We have what we call the pre-classical, which would be the prophets that didn't do any writings. And we just know about them from what we read about them. So that's Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha. And then we get into what we call the classical time period, where we have prophets that are writing oracles, and it's mostly around the fall of Israel and the fall of Judah. So it's warning, it's calling people back into faithfulness. And those fall of Israel is Amos and Hosea. Fall of Judah is Isaiah, Micah, Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Jeremiah. And then we get into what we call the exilic prophets. And then next week, we'll also look at what we call the post-exilic prophets. So exilic prophets are those that prophesy during the time of the exile. And that's going to be Ezekiel and Daniel. So that's where we are now. We are in the time of what's called the exilic prophets. And before we start reading the great stories today, let's look at the context of Daniel. And when we begin to look at context for a book, we start with what we call internal evidence. What does the Bible say about itself? What does the book of Daniel say about itself? And then what we also can do is we can also look at external sources, which we call extra-biblical sources, where we can look at what do other narratives, other books say about Daniel or about this time period. But to really begin to look at context, I think we start internally. And so let's just open up to the book of Daniel, which I'm excited to be in. So the first question I always ask is context. Who wrote Daniel? And it's jumping ahead, but in Daniel 9:2, 20, and 10:2, he has very specific points where he says, I, Daniel. And so we get the sense that Daniel is our author. He's the one who wrote this book. Let's look at just thinking, when do the events in this occur, and thinking historical context. Let's read Daniel 1:1-2. And thinking of having those 2 questions in mind. When do you think the events in this occur, and what was the historical context going on at the time of Daniel? So in Daniel 1:1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasures of the house of his God. So what do we see, first of all, in the 3rd year of the reign of who? Jehoiakim. So it's so interesting because, so in the 3rd year, that's so interesting because I understood it to be 3 months, but maybe I had that wrong. But, we're going to go with what the scripture says. So in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar marches on Babylon. So, but what's important is we see that this is going on right before the end of Judah, right? We're just about to go into exile when this book begins. So that gives us a sense of when does this occur, but then also that gives us a sense of our historical context, right, that we've just gone through, that the kings of Judah that we're at nearing the very end, we're about to have our huge deportation. Nebuchadnezzar is in charge of the ancient Near East, and he's sweeping through. I put some maps on your tables if you ladies want to share, just to give you a sense. They call it Neo-Babylon at this time period. So Neo-Babylon is Nebuchadnezzar's, what he conquers as he sweeps through the ancient Near East. So you can see how Judah is going to be right in the midst of that, of this the whole area that he conquers during his reign, and very quickly. So, third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim. So this is 605 BC that these events are occurring. It's the first time Nebuchadnezzar sweeps through Judah, his conquering campaign. Judah does not. Hold on. I feel like I'm getting this wrong right now myself. If I am confused, you ladies must be a little bit confused. Okay. So, yes. So Jehoiakim, okay, that's it. I was right. Okay. So Jehoiakim is king, right? The first time Nebuchadnezzar arrives. Okay. And he is not destroyed. So 605 BC, he is left in charge. He's left as king, but he's a vassal. So it's in 598 that he rebels, and then his son, Jehoiakim, is the one left to face Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so are we kind of tracking? I feel like if I have to look at my notes, you ladies must be.
In charge after the walls fell of Jerusalem?
Hezekiah is before this. Hezekiah has already passed. Was that your question? Zedekiah, yes. Okay, so let's review that one more time. So on his first conquering campaign, Nebuchadnezzar sweeps through the ancient Near East. Jehoiakim is king. He is made a vassal, but left. So then he will rebel, and Nebuchadnezzar will then march on Jerusalem. He also dies and leaves his son Jehoiakim in charge. Jehoiakim faces Nebuchadnezzar. He surrenders, taken into exile. And at that point, Zedekiah is set as king, and he will rule for 9 years, and then he will rebel, and then it'll be the end. So, the uncle. Yes, exactly. So, Jehoiakim is in charge. So it's in the third year. Okay, now I'm getting this in my own mind. So in the third year of Jehoiakim being in charge, Nebuchadnezzar is on his conquering campaign, his initial conquering campaign. Okay, so that should make sense. All right, so Judah is not yet in exile. Nebuchadnezzar is still going to return 2 more times before Judah is fully destroyed. We learned from the text, actually, that Daniel is going to live for the entire duration of the exile. He's actually going to live for 70 years. We believe he was probably about 18 or 19 when he was brought into exile at this very first attempt, or this very first time that Nebuchadnezzar sweeps through. Daniel will actually see the Medo-Persian Empire take over, and he's going to, under Cyrus the Great, who will take Babylon, and he will remain alive this entire time, which is amazing. So it's a whole transition of a whole new conquering power is going to come through, and he's going to remain alive. We think the events occur in it somewhere pretty much between from 605 BC to 536 BC, so during the life of him. And what's interesting is we'll get there, but we often think of Daniel in the lion's den as being a story of when he was young, but he was actually probably about 80 years old, because it's when a man named Darius is in charge under Cyrus that those events occur, which is interesting to me. Okay, so when was it written? Not afterwards, but as the events are going on. So remember how when we were dealing with Moses in the Pentateuch, he's writing about events that occurred even hundreds, possibly thousands of years before he was born, because he talks about creation. But we are reading someone writing a text about the exact events that were occurring during his life and writing them down, which is fun. So audience, you ladies can probably guess, who would Daniel have been writing to? Who would be his intended audience, do you think? Exiled Israelites, exactly. So he's writing to his own people, exiled Israelites. So the Israelites in exile. And just think for a sec, original intent. If the people of Judah, all people of Israel at this point, are in exile, and he's writing these stories. Why do you think that he would be writing them? And just to think that they're in exile, they're separated from Jerusalem, separated from the temple, they're surrounded by people who worship false gods. What would be his point? Why would Daniel want to write his stories down? Any thoughts on that? Keep them faithful. I love that. Anything else? What was that? To be a witness. I love that too. I think exactly. I think that he is reminding the people that God is still in control. God is still in authority and in power. I think he's also going to be reminding them to worship God alone, because we're going to see the stands that these men take to stand up for God. That even though they're in this country that worships other gods and idols, how should the people in exile, how should they still act? How should they live? So biblical context, where does this book occur? In the Bible. It's actually the 26th book after Ezekiel in the prophetic section. So just remember, again, thinking sort of grouping. So first we start with the Pentateuch that Moses writes, and following that, the rest of the historical books. And then we get the poetry and then the prophecy. And so in the Old Testament, our books are not grouped entirely on a chronological order. They're grouped by genre. So right now we're in the prophetic section of the Bible. And so you can kind of guess genre of Daniel. Any thoughts on what kind of writing we're looking at when we read the text? There's two. I'll tell you that. There's two main times. Historical narrative, that is definitely a portion of it, historical narrative. And it's actually about half of the book is historical narrative. And how are we supposed to understand allegorical or literal when we look at narrative? Literal, exactly. So we're supposed to understand it literal when we're looking at a narrative portion. But half of the book is also prophetic. And prophetic is generally written in what style of writing? Poetic, exactly. So when we're in our prophetic, poetic section of Daniel, we're supposed to understand it as truth, but sometimes it's allegorical truth. It's the meaning. And then it gets kind of, parts of Daniel can be very hard to interpret. I actually would love to spend like 6 weeks on Daniel. Like there's so much in it. It would be really fun to do like a big study of Daniel, because there's part of it that goes into what we call apocalyptic literature, and that comes from the word, Greek word, apocalypsis, meaning revelation or disclosure. So Daniel begins to talk about end times. And we also get pictures of the person of Jesus in his writings, which is really amazing. And to be honest, I don't have time to go through prophecy today, but I think that would be a really fun time to spend some time at some point looking at the prophecy in Daniel. And just one other interesting thing about Daniel is it's actually written in two different languages. So it's written in Hebrew and it's written in Aramaic. The majority of the narrative portion is written in Aramaic, and I didn't actually know, like, where did Aramaic come from? So I looked it up, and Aramaic was the language of Neo-Babylon. So at this time period, Daniel begins to write in the language of the people around him, which I think is interesting. But then what's also interesting is for some reason the very beginning and then also the prophetic section is all in Hebrew. So that would be an interesting thing to think about that a little bit more too. But I think to me, that's very interesting that he's writing the narrative piece in the language of the common person around him. And then also, I think that's interesting too, because when we get to the New Testament, portions are written in Aramaic. Jesus actually speaks in Aramaic. And so we're like, well, where did that language come from? It came from them living in Babylon for a certain portion for the exile, which I just think is very interesting. So that was a new fact for me. Maybe y'all are not nerds like me to get excited by new facts like this, but I was like, oh, that's where the Aramaic came from. So I'm not going to focus on the prophecy today, though I think it's super interesting. I just don't have time to unpack it, and I would need to study it a lot more. But I think it would be fun to look at that at some point. So, just a sort of overview. So Daniel prophesies about the coming empires that are going to follow. So he talks about there's going to be Babylon. Babylon is going to end. And after that, he prophesies the Medo-Persians are going to come in, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And so historically, scholars have argued about whether he truly wrote Daniel, whether he wrote it during his time period, because his prophecies are accurate. But we believe that it was inspired by God and that he did have these visions of who the coming kingdoms would be. And what's really cool is that he prophesies that during the time of the fourth kingdom, which is the time of Rome, the Messiah is going to come. So he's very specific about the timing of when that's going to happen. And scholars have also understood his predictions to specify even a certain time that the temple will be rebuilt, the Messiah will come, and then the final destruction of the temple in AD 70. So I think that's all kind of fascinating, and lots of scholars have looked at that mathematically. But again, I don't have time to cover that today. That's just a teaser. You could get a commentary and go read Daniel. And then he also talks about a vision of the end times and of a son of God exalted. And so I just think that's fascinating and fun, but we're not going through it today. So interesting. I did mention Daniel lives through the entire 70 years of his exile. And there's kind of sort of three great stories of Daniel. And if we have time, I would love to go through all of them. But let me start by setting the context. Who is Daniel and who are his friends that we're going to be talking about? So let's go to Daniel 1 through 7. I started it, but I'll read the beginning again. So in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put it in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. And what's interesting too to me is that those two of those three names have been found in writings of Babylonian as listing them as people who were sort of governors or in charge during that time period. So I think that's fun too. Okay, so we see that time and place. So Daniel and his friends are taken by Nebuchadnezzar, right, in his first sweep through. They're young Jewish men selected to be trained in the courts of Babylon. Why? Why do you think that they wanted to do this? Any thoughts? Why were these men sort of being trained in the courts of Babylon? What do you think was the intent of Babylon to do this? Yes, absolutely. Sort of indoctrination, right? Paul on Sunday said it was sort of like the School of Babylon, the University of Babylon for 3 years. And that the names of the four men that were chosen, but it's interesting, never list their parents. So we don't know who they came from. That's why we assume that they were probably just taken as young men without their families when Nebuchadnezzar came through. And it's interesting that they're all given Babylonian names. They're changed from Jewish names to names that actually reference pagan gods. And what is also interesting, and Paul made the note on Sunday, that they didn't seem to have an issue with their names being changed, that they must have had such an identity in who they were. That didn't really matter what they were named or what they were called. And my Bible made a note that they had no parents, they had new names, but they definitely had a clear understanding of who they were and where their loyalties lay, which is probably like every parent's dream, right? That's what we want for our children. Like to be, if they were without me, how would you do? Which is amazing. So let's keep reading. So picking up in the story in Daniel 1:8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, I just did a little bit of research. Why would they have considered it defiling? And most likely it's because the food that the king ate would have been food that was sacrificed to idols. And in Leviticus, there is an instruction that we should never, that Jewish people were never to eat food sacrificed to other idols. So it would have been considered unclean. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat just the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So we agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and fast and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there into the first year of King Cyrus. So in verse 9, who causes the official to show favor to the men? God, exactly. So God is the one who works in this person to cause him to have compassion. So we're in exile, new nation, different gods, but who's still in charge? God. And I think that's very comforting to us now in our lives. And so what request does Daniel make?
He wants to eat vegetables and water.
Yeah, vegetables and water. No wine, no meat. And most likely because the food from the king's table would have been sacrificed to idols. And so to me, I think we kind of marvel at his faithfulness, right? To just say, nope, I'm not doing that because that's not the law of my God. Now, the official is worried that Daniel and his friends will look unhealthy to him. And so Daniel suggests a test. So he says, let them only eat vegetables for 10 days and let's see how they look. And so what's the result? How do they look? Great. And so he says, fine, you can keep doing this. And notice in verse 1, it says he remains in the court until the first year of Cyrus. So this is, again, giving us historical information about his lifetime. So 605 BC, he's taken. Cyrus comes in at 539 BC and takes over. And then it's the following year, in 538 BC, that Cyrus is going to issue the edict that the people, the Jews in Babylon can return to their own land. So he's going to follow this entire line, the entire events of the exile. Okay, so now following this, so this sort of sets our context. Who are these young men? Where are they? What are they like? And now following this, Nebuchadnezzar is going to have a dream. And let's read about what happens. So I'm going to pick up our story in chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. And I'm skipping over, and then I'll do 10 through 12. So in the second year of his reign, so just imagine this is only the second year of his reign, of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So he has conquered the ancient Near East. He swept through Babylon, and it's the second year of his reign. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. When the astrologers answered the king, then the astrologers answered the king, may the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. The king replied to the astrologers, this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I'll have you cut into pieces, and your house is turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. And skipping down to verse 10. The astrologers answered the king, there is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So, is that great? Yeah. So Nebi kind of like summons his like inner circle of wise men, right? And he tells them not only to interpret his dream, but to also do what? Tell him what the dream was, which is crazy. So Nebi won't even tell them what his dream was. He says that they have to describe it. They have to first describe it and then interpret it. And what do the advisors tell him in verse 11? What do they say? No one can do this. They say only the gods can do this, which is so great. And then the Nebuchadnezzar then orders what? What's going to happen to all the wise men? Kill them all. So that's going to include Daniel and his friends because they are considered the wise men. And so let's see what Daniel's going to do. So I'm picking up our story in verse 13. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You've given me wisdom and power, and have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king." So let's look at that for a sec. So he pulls the officer aside, and Daniel asks, what does he ask for? Time. He says, ask for some time. So then Daniel goes to his friends, and what does he ask them to do? Pray. Don't you love that? Yes, he does. He asks his friends to go and intercede for him. And I love that. And that's such like an example to us, of whatever we're going through, whatever circumstances are happening in our lives, that going to some friends, asking them to pray for us. Like, that's just such a great example to us. So during the night, the dream is revealed to Daniel either in a vision. So either he's praying and he has this vision, or maybe he's sleeping and dreams the vision. We're not sure. But and then what is Daniel's response to God after it's revealed to him? Praise. Yeah, I love that too. So then Daniel goes before Nebuchadnezzar, tells him the dream, and sorry. So skipping back. Did I read all of it? Yes. Okay. So he's going to now go. Okay, so after this, Daniel then goes before Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to tell him his dream and interpret it. I'm not going to read through that whole portion. But it's interesting because this is our first bit of prophecy. So this is when he talks about the coming kingdoms that are going to come. So this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has is this dream of what kingdoms are going to be coming following him. So there are two parts to this section that are really awesome that I want to read, though I'm not going to read the full section. So first, I want to read the portion when Daniel stands before Nebuchadnezzar. What does he say? It's great. So I'm going to read Daniel 2:26 and 20 through 28. So picking up. So the king asked Daniel, called Belshazzar, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" And Daniel replied, and this is what I love, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were lying in bed are these." And then he goes on to tell him all about the dream and describe it. So I just love that. So does Daniel say that he can interpret the dream? No, he says he can't. He says, but in verse 28, who can? God. There is a God in heaven. And I love that. And I just love those words of Daniel. And so he can't do it, but God can. And the other portion I really love is, so after Daniel describes and interprets the dream. Let's look at Nebuchadnezzar's response. So Daniel, skipping over to verse 45. So I'm still in chapter 2, verse 45. So the great God, this is Daniel speaking, has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all of its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So, who does Daniel give credit to? God. I love that. And so, and then in verse 47, who does Nebuchadnezzar give credit to? God. He says, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings. And then what position is then given to Daniel? Ruler. So ruler over the province of Babylon. So we understand that in the whole nation, or the kingdom of Babylon, there were certain provinces. So he would have been over most likely the capital province, where the capital of Babylon was. And then Daniel asked that his friends also be given high positions, and they're made administrators, so most likely under him. So administrators over Babylon as well. So now Daniel's now governor over Babylon. His friends are administrators. Nebuchadnezzar has praised God in this last paragraph, but he's not a believer. He's not a God-fearer. And we're going to see and we know that based on what's going to happen next. So Nebuchadnezzar is going to make a statue, and it's 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, made out of gold. And he's going to tell everyone that they must bow down to this statue. It could have been a statue of himself. We're not really sure what it was. It could have been an attempt to unify Babylon under one religion, forcing all people to bow down to this statue. So, but we also know that, are the Jewish people allowed to bow down to foreign gods? No. And so for some reason, Daniel isn't in this story. We're going to assume that he probably stays in the capital city of Babylon and does not go. As we're going to read the story, everyone is called to a certain plain to go and bow down to this image. We're assuming that Daniel is just not there. So that he most likely didn't travel to what they call the plain of Dura, where this was constructed. But let's find out what happens to his three friends. So his three administrator friends, they are going to be called with everyone else to come and bow down to this statue. So I'm going to pick up our story in Daniel 3, verses 8. Everyone has been told to bow down, but these three are not going to. So at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." I'm going to pause there for just a sec. So, did you say strength? Is that what I heard? Yeah, it's so strong, isn't it? It's so great. So, the three friends are called by their Babylonian names at this point. Notice that it's the astrologers who come forward to denounce them, and that they focus obviously on the three that are in power. Nebuchadnezzar didn't know that they were not bowing down to his image, apparently. And maybe that these Babylonians did not like having these three Jewish men in a position of high power. I'm not really sure. But I do think it's interesting that they speak publicly against their character. They pretty much defame them. And I was thinking about that, so it's interesting. So, if people were to do that to us, how would we respond? If someone were to say something bad about you to other people, which as women, it happens, right? So I just think about how these three respond. So in verse 16, the three say, are they going to defend themselves to Nebuchadnezzar? What do they say? No. So we don't need to defend ourselves to you. And I wonder sometimes if it's because they knew who they were accountable to. And does it matter really what others say about us or what other people do? It really doesn't. So I love what the three of them say in verse 17. Who can deliver them? God. The God we serve can deliver them. And then I love this too, but even if he doesn't deliver them, will they bow down? No. Which, as I was thinking about it, I was like, well, that is kind of funny because if they get thrown in and God doesn't rescue them, they're dead, right? So they're still not bowing down. So they're dead. So how does Nebuchadnezzar react? Okay. Daniel 3:19 and following. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than the usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes and trousers and turbans and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the Son of God's. I love that. Let's pause there just for a sec. Okay, so what does a furnace look like? So I decided to just do a little bit of research on what does a furnace look like and why. And so according to the Logo software, they noted that it's not only a horrifying way to die, to be thrown into a fiery pit, but probably it was convenient because there must have been a huge kiln there that they would have been using for to smelt the metal for the gold plating and the manufacturing of bricks. So probably this huge kiln existed because they had just created this huge statue. So it's possibly a matter of convenience that, oh, well, I have this huge fiery furnace, throw them in there. And as scholars have looked at what they call bas reliefs, which are sort of stone like pictures that would have been drawn during that time period, Mesopotamian smelting furnaces look kind of like a milk bottle, like an old-fashioned milk bottle, if you can imagine that, with a opening at the top so the ore can be put inside, and so sort of that skinnier top, rounder bottom, and then probably a smaller opening at the bottom to stick in wood and charcoal. So I put on the pictures on your tables what some people sort of pictured that this may have looked like, to what this furnace would have kind of looked like, how they would have seen the people inside of it. So how much hotter does Nebuchadnezzar make the furnace? What does it say? 7 times. So it's so hot that who dies in the process? Verse 22. So it's just bringing them up, right? It's so stinking hot that the people throwing them in die. So the 3 are tossed in with their robes and trousers and turbans and all the stuff that they're wearing. And then the miraculous happens, right? Then suddenly they see a 4th man walking around. And how is that 4th man described? He looks like what? Like the son's of Son of Gods. I love that. And so many believe there was not just an angel, but we call a pre-incarnate Christ. So of Christ appearing, being with these men to protect them, which is really cool. And don't you just love this image of Jesus being in the furnace with them? And Paul made this really great point on Sunday that God does not keep us out of the furnace. That's not his point in our walk, but that when we are in the furnace, that Jesus is in it with us. And what an awesome image that is for us. And what he also talked about, Paul mentioned on Sunday, is that he also feels like that experience for them of walking through that furnace is what's going to end up giving them a lot of influence. And that sometimes God has us walk through hard circumstances because of the purpose of what's coming out of it, that maybe will give us possibly influence, small or large, and just sort of an ability to share like our story, our experience. And so probably all of you ladies have stories in your lives of feeling like you were in a fiery furnace, of walking through times that were hard or painful, but just that knowledge that Jesus is with you in those moments. And me too. I mean, I'm 42 now, and I look back, I think I've just shared very briefly of some of the struggles I went through when I was younger. And but now, as I look back on that pain, I really see so much purpose of having walked through it. Like, it was hard. It was hell. I hated it at the time. But to now be able to look back and see the work that God did in me through that process, where he's brought me now through it, and because of it, is now I'm so thankful for. But being in that furnace is what's hard. And but I thought that was I just love that image. I think it's very encouraging. So Nebuchadnezzar sees the four men in the furnace. What is he going to do? Let's pick up our story, Daniel 3, verse 26. So Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. So they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble." Seems to be his favorite way of demise. Yes. Cut them into pieces, turn their houses into rubble. Okay. "For no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So notice how Nebuchadnezzar in verse 3 in verse 26 addresses them. What does he call them? He calls them servants of the Most High God. And so he has definitely recognized the miraculous, right, in this moment. And notice what his response is in verse 28. What does he do? What does Nebuchadnezzar do in verse 28? He praises God, which is really amazing. And so I love how in verse 28, he says, what were they willing to do? What does it say that the three men were willing to do? They're willing to what? Give up their lives rather than worship another God. And then how is their, what I think too, just thinking about this, how is their ability to practice their faith altered because of this experience? What are they now able to do? Trust God, but what are they even able to? Keep going.
He said that their God is not to be warred against. If they were
Yes.
to pray.
Yes. So they were given the ability to then worship God freely. Now so these three men are in high positions in Babylon, but Babylon has a ton of Jewish people in exile. So think about how this now has influenced all the other people in exile as well. So now not just these three men, but all of the Jews in exile are going to be able to worship God freely because of this, which I think is really cool to think of sort of that bigger picture. So these three are singled out, but it's going to affect all of the Jews. And then what happens to the three men afterwards? Promoted, exactly. And just what I think is interesting, and this is something that I'm still kind of like learning through and processing, but when Jesus shows up on the scene, there is a very strong Jewish identity. Like the Jewish people know who they are, and we've got our Pharisees, we've got our Sadducees. It's a very strong Jewish identity. But when they're going into exile, they're all worshiping false gods. The majority of them don't have this deep sense of Jewish identity. So I've kind of wondered, when did that form? How did that form? And I wonder if it's during this period of exile that as they are now living in another nation, if that Jewish identity really begins to take root. And we'll look at them returning coming up in the next weeks, and then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what's called the intertestamental time period. But we're going to see them really becoming a Jewish people. And so I just wonder about that. So following this historically, oh goodness, we're not going to do Daniel today. Lion's Den today. Following this historically, Nebuchadnezzar is going to die. He's going to be succeeded by his son and 3 more family members, all in the period of 40 years. And then his last sort of prince, Belshazzar, rules over Babylon kind of under his father. And we have this really interesting story of his writing on the wall. And Daniel's called in to interpret it. And through that point, and right after that, the Medo-Persians are going to sweep in under Cyrus. And they're going to take over all of Babylon. So we're going to get, at that point, the story of Daniel in the lion's den under a ruler named Darius. We believe he was the governor of governor under Cyrus, because Darius is actually never mentioned in any extra biblical sources ever. He's only mentioned in the Bible. So even though he's called a ruler, so we believe he must have been a ruler under Cyrus. It's possibly another name for a man named Gubaru, who was noted in extra biblical sources as the governor of Babylon. It also could be a title, the royal one, which is the way that the name Darius is translated. So anyway, I did really want to go through Daniel and the lion's den, but I think we're going to have to end without going through it today because we had so much scripture. I would love you ladies to read it on your own. It's such a great story. And when you read it in mind, keeping in mind that Daniel was probably about 80 years old when he had this experience. And that, and what's interesting to sort of note as you read the story, that Darius loved Daniel. He put him in charge of all of his nation, really, and that Darius did not want Daniel to be killed, but it's 3 men or his visors are going to come forward, and they're not going to like this Jew is in charge. And what they say is that they cannot find anything against him. He is trustworthy in all things, which I think is amazing. He has no corruption or negligence in him at all. And I was thinking, is that true about me? Like no corruption, no negligence, trustworthy in everything. And so these men are going to go after his relationship with God, and they're going to have Darius, the leader, put out this edict that anyone who worships anyone but Darius is going to have to die. Is going to have to be thrown into the lion's den. And VeggieTales has this great song where it talks about, it's kind of going through this dialogue, and they're like, and then Darius says, well, what happens if they don't? And then the sort of like the think tank go, we'll throw him into the lion's den. And then Darius goes, oh, that'll do it. Like, if anyone doesn't worship me, throw him in the lion's den. Okay. But then what he doesn't realize is that Daniel, his right-hand man, is going to be one of these people. And so what's great, too, is that the story tells us that Daniel goes and throws open his windows and starts praying to God 3 times a day like he always has. And it's kind of like, bring it on. Yeah? You want to deal with this? And then, of course, they catch him praying and bring him before Darius. And Darius is like, no, not Daniel. But he does. He ends up getting thrown into the lion's den. And then Darius comes out, and it's this great phrase where he says, Daniel, has your God saved you? And he has. And Daniel says that an angel has come and has shut the mouths of the lions and that he was unharmed. So then Darius realizes that these other advisors were really just trying to get Daniel, and so decides to throw all of the advisors and their families into the lion's den. And it's the text says that they get crushed, like even before they hit the floor. So great fun. I mean, these stories, I think, are so great because we just see these men standing up in this foreign nation. In Daniel, we see that God is sovereign, that he rules over individual lives and is sovereign over history. I think this message comforted and strengthened the Jews in exile, but it's also for us too. It comforts and strengthens us. I think we stand in awe the way these men stood for God in our idolatrous culture. I love seeing how the three men stood when everyone else bowed, and how Daniel threw open his windows and prayed when you weren't supposed to. And Paul asked this great question on Sunday. He said, when do we say that, changing my name is no big deal because I know my identity and I know who I am? Or when do we say, no, I will not submit to your rules and your regulations? I thought that was a great question that we ponder sort of in our lives of living in a culture that does not favor, following God wholeheartedly, that brings tons of idols around us in different forms every day. And how do we respond and how do we live? So I will conclude. For any of you ladies who have time, what I was thinking is, if you have time to stay and chat, share a story of how a time you felt you were in a fiery furnace and how God met you there. And if you've seen any kind of purpose of having gone through that furnace, and then also share any prayer requests you have. So thank you so much for coming, ladies. And I think what I will do is I will play a little VeggieTales in the background for a few minutes because it's amazing. Thank you, ladies.